Well, hello everyone, Shiloh family, friends of Shiloh, anyone out there who just happened on this video. It is not by accident. This is a Mental Health Monday episode. However, we are going to flip the script a little bit. Our regular Mental Health Monday host is going to be our guest, and I'm going to host today. And so it's going to be a wonderful opportunity to get the audience perspective so that you guys can hear a little bit more. I'll get to ask the resident psychotherapist the questions and have your perspective. And yeah, and we'll get to pick her brain a little bit. And the topic we're talking about today is a really important one, is a topic that is very much on the fore of many people's minds, needs to be discussed because it is becoming an epidemic.
Yes.
And so yeah, we're going to be talking about mental health among our children and our youth. And so just to kind of set the scene for us, resident psychotherapist Almarine, you work in this area, in the area of children and youth, more so youth, right? Sorry?
Yes.
Youth. So can you paint us a picture of what the everyday is like for you nowadays?
Um, it definitely has changed. I find that in our language, we often talk about at work pre-pandemic and pandemic changes. What we've noticed is that the mental health, a lot of clients or a lot of young people who used to struggle with a mental health problem, it's now progressed to a mental illness, right? Where it's diagnosable. And it's to the point where they're not able to function at all. They're not, and we'll talk about the different changes that parents can look for, but it's to the point that it is so critical that most of the youth that we're working with are being hospitalized, unfortunately. And so the system is so taxed with resources, with limited resources, and that could include just the actual therapist who do the work as well, because living in a pandemic, they're also struggling as well. And so you have a system that really is struggling. And so the issues have increased in terms of severity. And we now see a lot of youth who are struggling with eating disorder. And anyone who knows anything about eating disorders, it could all either be connected to body image, but it could also be connected to a lot of emotional struggles and the need to control something. And the one thing that most people can control, or most youth can control, is their body, right? And so we're seeing a lot of eating disorders, a lot of really, really major depression where these youth cannot even do their schoolwork from home. So we're in a system right now where I think it's by the grace of God that a lot of these young people are, they're doing okay. They're not doing well, but they're surviving.
Okay. And I just want to contextualize that a little bit more. I read an article, a local article, CTV News, said that even in CHIO, they're declaring a mental health emergency among
Yes.
children and youth as the pandemic wears on. They're saying that they're seeing many children's hospitals. It's not just CHIO, but CHIO is one of the big ones sounding the alarm, but many children's hospitals are sounding the alarm, declaring that we're in a mental health emergency among our children and youth.
Yes.
The term code pink, I've seen that quite a bit, referring to a pediatric emergency. They're saying, and I'm quoting directly from this article, suicide attempt admissions have increased by 100% on average during the pandemic, and admissions for substance use disorders have increased by 200%. And this was a report that they are actually quoting, and they say that 70% of children ages 6 to 18 have said that the pandemic has harmed their mental health. And I pull out those stats not to scare people, and not to be an alarmist, but to highlight the severity of the situation, right? As you said, there's overcrowding and there's burnout everywhere, not just the children, but the workers to whom they're turning for support. So that it tells me that this is very serious, that not only is it very serious, but it's likely to affect all of us at some point, right? At some turn. And so we all, as parents, caregivers, child and youth care workers, guardians, teachers, we have to take this seriously. If we don't have a child experiencing mental health problems, then we likely know a child. So what should we be looking out for, Almarine? What should we be what should we be aware of?
So rather than say kids or youth or teenagers, I'm just going to use the word child, just to kind of cover infant, toddlers, preteen, adolescent. And so typically there are 4 areas that parents or that loved ones will notice changes. And so for the first one, it would be a change in their feelings. So you'll notice over time that one area in terms of their feelings, how they feel or how they respond to certain situation doesn't match that specific situation. You may view it as overreacting, you may view it as surprising because it's just so abnormal from their daily pattern. And so these changes that I'm going to be talking about, there are things that are different and things that make you wonder or question and wonder what that's about. So their reactions or responses don't match the situation. You may notice that your child is starting to seem or feel more unmotivated, talk about being lonely, feeling alone, maybe feeling misunderstood, angry, scared, guilt. So any of those feelings that typically will make someone feel less than optimal or less than at their best, that's another indication. You may see feelings such as more negative feelings about themselves, right? They may become more overcritical of themselves, feel that they're not good enough, feel that they may not be worthy. So any kind, maybe more irritated, frustrated, angry. So any of those feelings that is totally out of the norm for your child would be something I would say a bit of a red flag.
Okay. So things like outbursts.
Outbursts, just feeling sad all of a sudden. And it's not to say sad is a bad thing, but if you notice that more days or more times out of the days, they look sad or they seem sad, those are some keys that there's something that's probably bothering your child and affecting their mental health. So remember, struggling with mental health doesn't mean that you have a mental illness, because mental health has to do with how we function, how we feel, how we adapt to things, how we behave. So those are all things, and we all have mental health.
I'm really glad that you pointed that out, because I'm sure there are people who are going to jump to that conclusion, who are going to go from one extreme to the other, thinking that I don't want my child to be seen as having a mental illness. And so thank you for pointing out that there's a very big difference between mental health and mental illness. And
it's something that we all have.
Yeah.
We all have mental health. It's about our mental wellness.
Yes.
And if we don't take care of our mental wellness, then it can lead to mental illness.
Okay. And just on that very same point, I came across, so the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and can make a contribution to his or her community.
Yeah.
And so that is
mental health.
A good definition of mental health. I don't know about you, Sister Almarine, but when I read that definition of mental health, it reminds me of 3 John chapter 1, there's only one chapter, verse 2, which is the founding scripture, or a founding scripture at Shiloh, which says, in the contemporary English version, it says, "Dear friend, and I pray all goes well for you. I hope you are as strong in body as I know you are in spirit.
That's perfect.
And I don't know if many people or enough people realize the connection to our mental health and the rest of our health. That mental health, our mental wellness drives everything else. I was, as I was kind of preparing for this, I was thinking about, unfortunately, and I hope that we can unpack this a little bit more, but we were called to look about our mental well-being. And in Proverbs 4, I believe it's verse 2, it says to guard your soul, to guard your heart, because out of it is the wellspring of life. Like out of your heart, out of your mind, you make all your life decisions. So there's a connection between our mental well-being, our mental health, and every other aspect of life. But I don't know that we do a good job of managing that. And for our children, it's so important that we teach this from early, because the enemy is after our children.
Yes.
And he comes after them successfully by infiltrating their mind, their thoughts, their thinking, whether it's about themselves or about how they view the world, how they view others. And some of the things that you pointed out, Sister Almarine, are the very things that the enemy would attack. And those are like when we were looking for signs of changes, that's what we need to be looking out for, where the enemy is at work. Something Pastor said, and I thought it was so profound, and it's a scary thought, but it's very true. He was saying that the enemy is after our children, and how he gets at them is by messing with their thinking, because if he messes with their thinking now, then he's pretty much guaranteeing a messed up future. Right? And it's a scary thought, it's a scary concept, but I think more parents, more caregivers, more guardians, more child and youth workers, those of us who surround everybody, needs to be concerned about the well-being of our children mentally, emotionally, spiritually, for that very reason. And so I think I'm really glad that you pointed out some of those changes that we need to be looking out for, because that means that they're starting to think differently about themselves or about others.
And that's a good segue into the second one, right? So the first one was noticing changes in their feelings. And then the second one would be noticing changes in their thinking, right? And you're right. I think part of the thinking, and you mentioned that, I think it's about not being aware. Our life is so busy, especially as parents. I mean, your priority is you need to provide for them. You need to get them up to school on time. You need to go to work. You need to do this and this and this and this and this. And a lot of times that can get in the way of, first of all, the Holy Spirit, listen to the Holy Spirit, but it can also just get in the way of being aware, of taking moments to understand that there are changes in thinking with your youth, but also with them as well. And so noticing changes in thinking, do you notice, especially with online school, is your child having more difficult concentrating? And it could be because they're not used to the technology, and it does a lot. It's very draining.
Fair.
But even through that, are they having problems focusing, concentrating? Do you notice that their schoolwork and their performance has significantly decreased? You notice that subjects that they used to love, they completely detest them and they want nothing to do with it. So it goes beyond just doing it online. It goes beyond their behavior, or the way they think about school has changed. Are they more self-critical? Do they think of themselves as unlovable, as stupid, especially if they can't function very well online? You may see your child thinking that they're stupid. Especially youth struggling mentally, they may not want to come to you because they think that they're a burden. So there's this idea that I think having that negative thought makes it very isolating, and make them feel very defeated, to the point where sometimes they may start having thoughts of hurting themselves. And that could either be suicide, or it could be them doing different forms of self-harm, right? And so those are things that when it comes to your child's mind, because what's in your mind is oftentimes what you speak.
Absolutely.
Right. And so if you notice that what they're speaking, it's just not very comforting, it's concerning, then I would say don't ignore them.
Mm-hmm. And just to, I mean, I don't want to belabor this point, but just to highlight the dangers that this can lead to in the future, what some of these things untreated, what happens?
Some of these things treated, I mean, it definitely, their functioning will continue to deteriorate, right? They will worsen. And then eventually it could build into a mental illness and mental disorder. And it could build into these your child wanting to kill themselves, right? So, and that could start, and we did a video on suicide, and I would really encourage parents to review that video again. It was really detailed and extensive. But a lot of teenagers, I would say 90 something percent of the teenagers who struggle with mental health problems or mental illness, there's an element of suicide there. And so suicide is not to support you. It may seem comforting, but really it's to take your life away and stop your child from living out the life that God intends for them. And so it's not to say if your child is struggling with mental health that they will become suicidal. No, it's just to say if these signs are not, if they're ignored or they're not attended to, it could progressively become suicidal or them hurting themselves by, could be cutting, it could be substance use, it could just continually be deteriorated.
Okay. All right. So what are some other some other changes that parents need to be on the lookout for?
A third change would be change in behavior.
Okay.
It could be, for instance, you notice that your child's hygiene becoming poorer and poorer. It's not about necessarily how they dress, but they may not want to shower, they may not brush their teeth, they may not care about their hair. They just roll out of bed.
That's not a phase.
No, I mean, there's a phase, but once again, it's something that is consistent. It's something that's out of their normal behavior. I mean, if your teenager usually get up every weekend and don't brush their teeth and so forth, it may not be an issue. But if you see that it start carrying over to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, that's a change from their normal behavior. Yeah. That's when you can be concerned. You may find that they're procrastinating a lot. And that could be either not having any interest in their regular task. They may not have any more interest in things that they love to be very passionate about. They don't have a lot of energy. They may spend a lot of time sleeping. They may overeat. They may even restrict their food. And that's something that we're seeing with a lot of youth right now in the pandemic. There's anorexia, purging, binging. So the eating order epidemic, I mean, the eating disorder, it's a crisis right now. Yeah. So that is something to look for. Are they more withdrawn? Do you find that they don't want to be with the family anymore? They find excuses to be in their room? Are they always on social media? Do you see them as almost as if they're detached? There's so many, just so many behaviors. Wow. And once again, it's the change out of their norm. And even though I haven't mentioned them because the list is so extensive, if it's a behavioral change that makes you take a pause, then it's something to be curious about.
Okay. So I'm gathering that the biggest takeaways from what you're saying are look for changes in behavior, look for anything that's out of the norm from what your child or the child is used to doing, and don't ignore.
No. And so it's out of the norm, I would say not a day, but if you consistently kind of seeing that it's becoming something more dominant, it's taking over more of their behavior, then I think it's something that needs to be paid attention to.
Okay. Wow, this is all very good. There's, as I said earlier, I want to address the idea of stigma and shame.
Yes.
So please talk, especially, I mean, it's bad enough for adults who, when they're when they're struggling with these things, don't want to address it because of stigma and shame. But when you're dealing with kids, when you're dealing with children, it's an even bigger deal. So can you talk to us about that?
When you're dealing with guilt and shame, or the stigma for children or for youth, is this idea of being a burden, right? Especially if you grow up in a home that has high expectations and checklists of how a child or a youth should behave, if they don't measure up to that somehow, or they feel or they believe, and this goes back again to the thinking, if they believe, whether it's true or not, because what we believe isn't necessarily reality, but if they believe that going to their parents will make their parents be more stressed, because parents are stressed during the pandemic. If they believe that, then they're going to feel ashamed. They're going to feel guilty that they're adding to their parents' burden. And they may start having this idea that I'm a burden, right? And so there's an element of shame, this element of what they're doing to their parents. So there's that piece. There's also about the culture in the family as well around mental health. Right? There are some culture, and from my experience, predominantly in, and I know a lot of people don't like this word, but racialized community or ethnic community, or like in indigenous communities, for instance, there's this idea that mental health doesn't exist, that I had it hard. Parents will often say, I had it hard. What are you complaining about? It's not a big deal. So there's this idea that you need to be a certain way. Your mental health needs to be a certain way, whether it's true or not. And so there is that stigma and that culture also in the home, this disbelief that mental health is something that you need to be on top of. Otherwise, it's a weakness. Otherwise, you're failed at something. You're failed at being a child, a son, a daughter, a mom. And so there's an element of the stigma is around a sense of failure and a weakness. And so you don't always just get it from the larger community, but you also can get it from your own family as well. And a lot of youth, they do believe a lot of those things.
I find it very interesting that you said you don't like to say this, but that the stigma seems to be more prevalent in racialized communities. But I will have you know that it's also in the media. It's not just you that has to say this. I read somewhere else another I think it's founder Sarah Austin, who is a founder and CEO of Children First Canada, so a children's organization that works for the well-being of children, says that the crisis, so the mental health crisis, is particularly impacting the most vulnerable, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children, Black and other racialized children, and children and youth with disabilities and complex medical needs.
Yes.
So just to let you know, despite the fact that you don't like to say it, it's unfortunately commonly known. The idea of stigma in racialized communities. But I did not think about what you said about the stigma for the child themselves and this idea of shame and not wanting to be a burden. That puts the onus even more on the adults to be on the lookout, to be true caregivers for our children. I really do hope that we take this seriously. So, Sister Almarine, this has been some very helpful and very useful information. But we are running, we're clearly having a really in-depth conversation that just can't be stopped. So why don't we pause here and allow people to digest this information?
Great idea.
And we continue another time.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So folks, stay tuned. We do hope that you will come back to hear more about what Sister Almarine, our resident psychotherapist, has to say about mental health and children.
And as always, I wish you good mental health experiences.